It's
Okay.
almost there. 1 second. It's almost there. It'll take some minutes. Okay, and we're live.
Almost there. 1 second. Okay. There. So now we're live. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Gabriel Bodar, a reader in digital classics at the Institute of Classical Studies at the School of Advanced Study to the University of London. He's an epigraphist and digital epigraphist, digital papyrologist. He works in the fields of digital classics, and he has worked in several epigraphy projects. He was a key research figure at the inscriptions of Aphrodisias project, at the inscriptions of the northern coast of the Black Sea, the Iospe project, the inscriptions of Libya, and he has also been the principal investigator of the Snapdragon project, which aimed at integrating different prosopographical databases from antiquity into one platform. He also has done work for the Duke Databank of documentary papyri, and is one of the creators of the papyri.info platform for inserting EpiDoc encoding in papyri documents. And he also is lecturing now on different subjects of digital classics, EpiDoc, text encoding and interchangeability, linked open data, and so on and so forth. And he will he would like to introduce you to what EpiDoc is all about, how it works, what is its history, and why it matters to us. So, Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mitko, and thank you, Martina. Thank you both for the invitation, and welcome to everyone. I hope you're going to enjoy this week of training and introduction to various materials. Let me see if I can share my screen just quickly. I think I want to share this screen. Can you all see that? Yeah. Yeah, as Mitko says, I'm partly going. Part of what I'm going to do is introduce a bit of the background to EpiDoc, but I'm going to do this through a bit of a narrative. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the different systems in use in digital epigraphy and some of the practices that that are behind the development of these systems. So I'm going to start from the development of standards in epigraphy and move through to the more advanced and futuristic and even incomplete and aspirational standards and technologies. And I also want to talk a little bit, or more than a little bit. I'd like to focus this really on some of the reasons why we want to use standards in epigraphy and in digital epigraphy and in digital humanities generally. I think all of the things we say on any sort of microcosmic field like this has applications across the much larger field. The first thing I should say is that for the second part there that I talked about, the background of some of the reasons we like to do these things using standards, I owe a lot of the content to Martina and also to our colleague Osama Gad, who have been discussing these ideas with me in an as yet unwritten up form, but that this is part of my way of thinking through these questions. So I don't take all responsibility for the good ideas that may come out of this, but I take all responsibility for any bad ideas that may remain in this, of course. So here's a rough overview of what I'm going to talk about. I hope to get through the first 6 points quite quickly so that we can have more of a discussion of the 7th point. But that's the general overline. I should also add that anyone who wants to see these slides at more leisure, there's a link to them in the bottom right-hand corner of every slide. So feel free to take a note of that, and you're welcome to look at and reuse any part of those as needed. So the first 6 parts of these are really talking about this sort of narrative of how we got to where we are with standards for epigraphy and related disciplines. And you'll see that EpiDoc doesn't turn up until the 3rd step of that. So really with, we want to start not even really starting with the Leiden system. We want to start even before that and think about the way people have done epigraphy throughout history. So the Leiden system came into being at a meeting in Leiden in 1931, and was a meeting of papyrologists there, and was developed in that context. But people have, of course, been working in papyrology for at least 40 years before that, and in epigraphy for hundreds of years before that, and in text editing generally for as long as people have been reading texts that were written in a previous age, which goes back to pretty much, 100 years after the invention of language, let's say, of written language, I mean. So we know, for example, that the ancient Greeks read inscriptions that were written a couple of generations earlier, but we don't have any sense that they explicitly were critical about the way they presented the content of those. They did say things like, we've read this and we think what they must have meant was, this text is missing, but what it must have said would have been. But we don't ever see transcriptions where they say this word was missing and I'm restoring it for these reasons, right? So for a long period of history, inscriptions were used as evidence for history, but until relatively recently, until the last couple of 100 years, restorations and emendations to those inscriptions were made silently. If you found what looked like a spelling mistake in an inscription, you would simply correct the spelling and you would present it in your publication as if it were correctly spelled. But in the 19th century, this changed and people started being much more critical and including various symbols to represent the various different interventions in a text. And we ended up, after the Leiden system was devised in 1931, and it wasn't obviously devised completely in a vacuum, with this sort of appearance. So you have a range of brackets, you have a few other symbols in there that represent various kinds of information about the physical state or about the interpretive interventions in the text being published. And so this is an example of what a print publication would have looked like any time over the last 90 years. So you see you have square brackets, you have round brackets, you have angular brackets representing different pieces of information. The square brackets are completely lost text that has been restored with a greater or lesser degree of certainty. The round brackets, the normal parentheses, represent the expansion of abbreviations or other kinds of expansion of omitted text, and the angle brackets represent either corrected or restored accidentally omitted text. So various different kinds of correction there, and it's quite important to an epigrapher to know which of those three things is going on, not just that this is not what was on the stone, but that this is the kind of intervention that the editor has made. There are other kinds of things in there which are a little bit less obvious. There's the choria representing a number, and that's partly representing the way things have conventionally been written. It's not unique to epigraphy. And there's things like the underdot beneath that pi there, which shows that letter, it's in context, it's clear that it's probably a pi, but if you only had the physical traces of the letter, that wouldn't be enough to tell you that it was a pi. And then finally, there's another kind of conventional symbol in here, which is probably pretty clear to everyone. If you've never done epigraphy before, you can probably pretty much guess what that a hyphen at the end of a line means, because that's been used for hundreds of years to represent a word that continues on the next line. And the 5 in the left bracket, even in the left margin, even if you weren't quite sure what was going on, you probably noticed that this is the 5th line, and they're numbering every 5th line or every 4th line or whatever of the thing. These are nevertheless conventional symbols, and someone had to make a decision that this was the way we were going to represent this sort of thing. You're probably most of you already aware with this, but I wanted just to highlight this, some of the most common parts of the Leiden conventions, just to show and to make the point that these are arbitrary mapping between the bracket and what the bracket represents, and they're highly systematic, and they're consistent, and they're well documented and well understood. Everybody who's using the Leibniz system uses square brackets to mean the same thing, with very, very small variations in local practice. All of those things that I've just described, the arbitrariness, the well-documentedness, the clarity, and the general understanding of this is absolutely key to the definition of the markup language, as we'll see. So moving forward a couple of generations from the Leibniz system in 1931, in the 1990s, the International Association of Greek and Latin Epigraphy, EGLE, convened a subcommittee called the Electronic Archive of Greek and Latin Epigraphy, which was tasked with coming up with a recommendation for how to encode, how to collect all of Greek and Latin epigraphy in a single database. And this being the 1990s, they were imagining a database in the sense of something like FileMaker or Microsoft Access, and it would be a database that would be delivered online in some form and searchable in a traditional way, with various fields and relational connections within it. And this turned into this sort of database of that kind in the late 90s, and it had, you know, what is fairly recognizable search interface, which the interesting thing I want to talk about here is not so much the technology behind it, but the fields that were chosen. So the fields that were chosen, so province, modern country, ancient city, modern city, find place, all these other kinds of information that we're finding, those are exactly the things that one says in an epigraphic or papyrological edition. What is the information you need to know about this object? And so here's an example just from one database. This is the sort of thing you say about an object. You talk about its location, you talk about its date, you talk about exactly where it was found, and you talk about previous publications, and so forth. A footnote in the first recommendation, the first written recommendation towards this commission, the Epigraphy and Information Technology Commission, who proposed the creation of EGLE, says that, and I suspect most people in this commission neither particularly understood, but certainly didn't really care what this footnote meant. But what this footnote meant, to translate it conceptually, not linguistically, was that whatever database you use to encode this coherent collection of epigraphic data, you must be able to export into XML. And this was for both for compatibility with other systems and for longevity. No database system, however well supported it was in 1996, still works now in 2021. But the raw data exported in XML could still be used in another system. It's in direct response to that 1999 publication that a group of young scholars at the University of North Carolina decided to make public some work they'd been doing on a system that they called EpiDoc XML for epigraphic documentation. And EpiDoc, as you know it now, is a direct descendant of that first publication in 2000. And this used a range of existing art, prior art, in order to try to make the conventions of epigraphy more sustainable in a digital context. So they recommended, rather than inventing a new encoding markup language, they decided to use XML, which has been used, well, SGML as it was until about 2000, they decided to use SGML and XML. They decided to recommend the use of the Text Encoding Initiative TEI XML, which had been used since 1988 as the de facto standard for encoding humanities text in general, not specifically ancient texts. They based their work very closely on the Leiden system of 1931, and in particular of the Krumrei Panchera and Panchera expressions of that system from 1980 and 1991 respectively. The encoding of the kinds of information that one talks about around the transcription of an inscription itself were based on the general fields in use in epigraphy, as we just showed a moment ago, those used in the Eagle databases and other databases that were in use at the time. And EpiDoc was always intended to be used with other disciplines as well as Latin epigraphy, and indeed was very quickly the first major project that adopted EpiDoc was a Greek epigraphy project, and it was very quickly adopted for papyrology, other kinds of inscribed ancient objects, and other scripts other than Greek and Latin. So it proved that to be very easily adaptable to other disciplines without massive amounts of special customization. What is EpiDoc? As Mitko said already, EpiDoc is it's more than any set of technical tools. It is a community. It is very much a set of projects, a set of individuals, and a set of reference materials shared by these individuals and projects and institutions. So in concrete, EpiDoc itself is the core EpiDoc community, I should say, are responsible for 4 sets of tools, which is to say the EpiDoc guidelines, which you will look at if you ever decide to encode anything in EpiDoc. The reference style sheets, which are a set of scripts for turning the EpiDoc XML into web pages or PDFs or text documents or other kinds of human readable, publishable materials. A schema, which is a menu of elements and attributes and structure and content that defines the limitations on what an EpiDoc XML file can look like. There is this tool called EFES, which is a simple to use publication platform, which can be very easily customized for multiple different kinds of projects, and has already been customized by at least a dozen or so that are in or close to publication now. And on top of these 4 tools, there is the EpiDoc training program, which you've already heard about, you've seen part of. It includes a whole bunch of videos on YouTube. It includes a whole bunch of slideshows that are reusable by others. They're all open licensed, and a range of experience behind the running of these programs. There are, at least a couple of dozen programs online for individual EpiDoc training courses that are available for reuse, which are full of links to materials and so forth. And there are a bunch of third-party tools, the Papyrological Navigator and the Papyrological Editor, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a version of the Perseids tool, which works on EpiDoc materials. There are the vocabularies and other tools that come out of the Eagle project and so forth, which all enhance the EpiDoc tool set, but aren't the responsibility of the core EpiDoc community themselves. They're produced by other projects, some of which are run by the same people who are in the core EpiDoc community, but the tools themselves are independent of that group. Just a note about EpiDoc training is that it's been one of the things we've talked about a lot over the last few years is how the commonalities between teaching EpiDoc and teaching epigraphy itself, in that both introduce these very technical practices while building on an underlying expertise in existing knowledge, and that they can be more or less run in parallel, but generally when you're learning epigraphic practice, you already have at least some background in Greek and Latin, right? Likewise, when you're learning EpiDoc, you generally have at least some background in classical text and or epigraphy. And that there are all sorts of reference materials, there are customized tools, but the most important thing in learning both of these is to have lots of practice. This is sort of to say that even if one were to say, let's teach epigraphy and EpiDoc from scratch on the same day, so, you know, an undergraduate student who has, you know, a certain amount of Greek and Latin comes into the classroom and you say, okay, first thing, we're going to do some epigraphy and we're going to do it in EpiDoc from scratch. This parallel, I think, would still hold. You'd still be doing the same sorts of thing in both facets or both axes of that teaching. And just to come back to this this assertion I made earlier that the Leiden system itself is a markup language, there are these correspondences between the symbols and marks and brackets and so forth on the left with the meanings that they bear on the right. And just to make it absolutely clear that this is totally parallel to EpiDoc, these are the EpiDoc recommendations for those same classes of information. So EpiDoc is clearly what we call a markup language, so is Leiden. You don't have to learn a new way of doing epigraphy to do EpiDoc, you just have to learn new symbols to represent the same underlying semantic pieces of information that you're representing. And likewise, the underlying principle of how you lay out an epigraphic edition, so not the transcription itself, but the other pieces of information that you put in addition, are all mapped directly in EpiDoc. So there's not it's not a new way of encoding information about an epigraphic object. It's just a new way of expressing that encoding. So the next couple of points just quickly to talk about the papyri.info project, which was one of another major early EpiDoc development, ran over a course of 4 or 5 years with about just over $2 million worth of money from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation over 3 phases, and introduced a lot of new practice and new tooling to the EpiDoc world. The two core parts of this were conversion tools for transforming existing data sets. These might have been databases, these might have been in SGML, or they might have been in as ancient an encoding scheme as something called beta code, which has been in existence since the 1970s for encoding ancient Greek. But it was very much about transforming these into EpiDoc, sometimes via a mechanism which enabled it to also be transformed back. So you didn't have to abandon the existing encoding in order to use this. The second part was the production of these tools, these 2 major tools, the Papyrological Navigator, which was a search and browse platform, which would present your EpiDoc files as human readable text files with a very powerful search interface, and the Papyrological Editor, which was built on an underlying piece of software called SOSOL, the Son of Suda Online, which was a workflow and editorial management tool, which enabled editors to create and edit EpiDoc editions of papyri without having to see the XML with those angle brackets of the kind that I showed you on an earlier slide. This was a not entirely perfect mechanism. I've always encouraged anyone who is going to use this tagless editing interface to learn EpiDoc first, just in the same way as you really ought to know a little bit about what an internal combustion engine is before you drive a car, even though you don't technically need to do so. It's useful for when things go wrong. But so these two tools have become extremely useful, both for the Paraded.info project itself and as an exemplar for the sorts of things that can be done for other projects. And the final thing, just as a footnote to this, is that documentation and dissemination and training was a part of this project that a lot of resources went into, partly on the encouragement of the funding body. This was the only time I've ever known a funding body to rather than giving you less money than you asked for a project, they gave us more money than we asked for. And they said, we want to give you this extra $50,000 and we want you to spend this on training to make sure that people use these tools you've built and that they don't just, you know, disappear into an echo chamber being used by you and no one else. So that was a really forward-thinking development and one of the more valuable things to come out of that project. And so there was this search interface that you'll find at Paraded.info is also the URL for that site. The second sort of follow-up project that built on EpiDoc in an important way that I want to talk about is the Eagle Europeana network, not to be confused with the Eagle database that I discussed earlier, although they both came out of Rome and were led by the same people, hence the same name, but they're actually quite different kinds of project. The Eagle Europeana network was effectively doing similar things to what the Papyrological Navigator did with papyri, in that it was using a very large number of existing epigraphic databases and providing transformations into EpiDoc for interchange and for sharing of information between them, but also transformations back for people who didn't want to lose their original database and they wanted to carry on working with them in that form. So there was a lot of migration, as I said, including bidirectional migration between data sets. And the Eagle Europeana network also built this huge community involvement, largely around translations, image identification, outreach workshop, tool building, and all sorts of things that got lots of different people engaged in this massive collection of digital epigraphic material based around a core of EpiDoc files. And the other thing that came out of this network, and this is significant as we're going to talk about linked open data in a moment, is the Eagle vocabularies. So on the one hand, it's helping to find shared vocabularies for some of the kinds of things we say about inscriptions. So as we were saying before, locations, types of inscription, types of text, material, criteria for dating, these sorts of things that are key to epigraphic and papyrological and other kinds of editions, but just to try and get some sort of consistency in when one project might say this is a funerary inscription and another person might say this is an epitaph and someone else might say this is a gravestone. What is the relationship between those things, and to what degree can we say these are the same kind of inscription, just called different things by different people and potentially in different languages? But the other aspect of this is that they were not only vocabularies in the sense of lists of words, but they were also encoded in a digital form, in the form of linked open data, to really encourage digital integration between various projects as well, and this larger network, not only of epigraphic projects but other kinds of projects that talk about ancient objects that had shapes and that were made of certain types of materials and that were dated in certain ways, whether they had text on them or not. And several of these things that I've just talked about led into the current, or what this is the point at which I'm talking about futuristic work, really, is the Epigraphy.info community, which is a successor in many ways to Eagle, which was a project that was only funded for 5 years by the Europeana Digital Library, and the Epigraphic Database Heidelberg, which was funded for 25 years, I think, but then reached the end of its funding period. And so there's this ongoing discussion about how to get these large data sets to continue to be useful and to continue to be used and developed. So there's a lot of talk about how we might delegate curation of epigraphic collections to national committees, questions about editing, questions about version control, questions about how to use linked open data to communicate between these various different databases and corpora, because it's all very well to say there's, this group is going to talk about all the Italian inscriptions and this group is going to talk about all the Croatian inscriptions, let's say, but there will be inscriptions that are relevant to both, or there'll be inscriptions, in one group that is relevant to people from the other, because it was set up. The inscription was found in the territory of modern Croatia, but it is named a person whose place of origin is in modern Italy. So both databases want to know about these. So how to really make sure these things don't become closed silos. This is very ongoing community discussion. There's the sixth Epigraphy.info meeting will take place in the next few weeks, and there are a couple of meetings a year of this community, really talking about how to take this forward. And one of the questions is, before we think about how to go about getting the millions of euros that we will need to really build a system to do everything, it's what exactly do we want this system to do? And what are the limitations of what we want to do? That this really needs to be decided and discussed. And so Epigraphy.info is also the URL again of the site that tells you more about that project. And the final thing I'll talk about in that sort of historical account is the Epigraphic Ontology, and this is very much a community in the sense that its only existence is that of a group of people talking about it, and it's more than just me and Pietro Luzzo. It's a slightly larger group of people than that, but it really is a discussion, and this is just a screenshot from the Google group email discussion list about it, but there are other places where this discussion takes place. There's the Linked Past conferences, one of the places that people talk about this. The Epigraphy.info groups is one of the places that people talk about this, and it came out of the core group of EpiDoc practitioners that I was talking about a bit earlier. So it's there's a lot of different communities who have a stake in this epigraphic ontology discussion. And as with every other ontology, it is only meaningful in as much as it is related to other ontologies and existing ontologies. So there's no point in inventing new language for expressing the relationship between objects and texts and descriptors and people and places and the other kinds of entities which are relevant to describing epigraphic objects, when some of these descriptors and relationships already exist in other ontologies. So there's the linked ancient world data ontology, there's a numisma ontology for ancient coins, EDH, the epigraphic database Heidelberg, have an ontology, the Eagle vocabularies are ontologies. So all of these ontologies need to be taken into account when working on this. There's a lot of progress has been made in the discussion of the epigraphic ontology. The reason that I'm not showing you a site which shows you what you can do with epigraphic linked open data on my next slide is that this hasn't quite been built yet. We need to see data put into this format. We need to see tools that can implement this format and can do cool things with them. And so that's where the ongoing work is. And of course, before someone can build that, before someone can go out and raise the funds that are needed to hire someone to build that, we need to decide exactly what we want that to look like and what needs to go on there. And these are not trivial overnight questions. So that's why that's ongoing work rather than something that we can show finished work. So I forget exactly what time we started. How long have I got to talk about the second half of my presentation?
You have as much as you want. We started like 20 minutes earlier, so. Yeah.
So we started nearly half an hour ago?
We started at like quarter to.
Okay, so I should try to get through this in about 15, 20 minutes, but you're not.
Don't worry.
If I've arrived, you're telling me. Okay, thank you. So, one of the things that that has been this is a slide which has been used in EpiDoc training for well over 10 years now, and the point I want to make at this point is that when you're encoding epigraphic information in digital form, whether that's in EpiDoc or in linked open data or in one of these other databases that are used, which are now all compatible with EpiDoc thanks to Papyrus.info and Eagle. What you're doing is you're encoding quite explicitly and in machine readable way, ideally, but quite explicitly and according to standards which are compatible with the way other people do this, exactly what you mean by your transcription, as well as simply what it looks like. You're encoding explicitly the distinction between what you know, what you're guessing, and what you're extrapolating from the evidence and from comparative information and so forth. And you also have to be quite clear in your encoding what it is you want to be able to encode for various reasons, and they can include because you want it to look in a particular way. I encode restorations in my digital edition because I want those to be wrapped in square brackets in my human readable edition. I encode personal names in my digital transcription because I want those to be indexed and searchable as personal names, as references to individual persons. So you're being very clear about what it is you're encoding. All of these, I hope it's clear from the title of this slide, are what epigraphers and any text editors in any discipline are doing anyway, or ought to be doing anyway, right? You're thinking about what you mean, and you're being as clear as possible about what you mean, and the various things that you know or don't know, or how you know them. So the digital edition is very much designed to meet the requirements of scientific publication. Scientific publication as we have meant it since the 18th century, since the Enlightenment University came into being, which is that we don't only tell you what we think these things mean, but we also give you the data and we give you our methodology so that you can reproduce it and you can see whether you agree. Okay, there's no point me telling you that this and this happened in the ancient world unless I give you the evidence so you can check whether I'm right or not. Not only to check whether I'm right, but also so that you can prove me wrong. Because, you know, it's almost guaranteed that, you know, within a certain amount of time, any major idea is going to be revised over time, and that's absolutely essential. That's why there are footnotes and bibliographies in all publications since the 18th century, and that's why we have open data and we have transparent tooling and methodology in digital publication. So we make sure we have images as well as transcriptions, so you can look and you can see where I've written a tau if you think that really is a tau. We have an apparatus criticus, so we're not only saying what we think, we're saying what we've corrected, and we're also saying what earlier editors thought, where they may have disagreed with us, but even where we agreed with them, we give them credit for ideas that we're following. And we link to other sources. We link to comparanda. We link to vocabularies such as ego vocabularies. When we say something is a balustrade, we link to a definition of a balustrade because not everybody necessarily knows what that is. And most importantly, we take responsibility for those things that are our innovations and developments, and we give credit for those things that are built on the work of others. And these are things that it's very important to do in digital form, just as much as in print form. And in some ways, it's easier to do in digital form, or to put it the other way, it's harder to gloss over in digital form than it is in print form. So in print, you can have a footnote that says, you know, I thank Martina Filosa and Osama Gad for a lot of the ideas here, but I'm not telling you which ideas, right? If I'd encoded this slideshow in XML rather than just in a presentation software, I could have attached to each particular line of each particular slide whose idea this was that I was talking about, right? So here, for example, in an apparatus criticus, I might want to say that on line 1 of my text, don't worry about if you don't understand the syntax of what's going on here, but here on line 1 of my text, I'm saying that there's this text which I, or an editor with these initials, has interpreted as Herthea, But an earlier editor, and this is a bibliographical source rather than individual editorial responsibility, that I'm using this as shorthand for, and this will be a pointer to a full definition of that bibliographical reference in this document. Read it as something else, but I'm reading it in a different way. And on line 3, a different kind of apparatus entry, I'm saying that these are two alternatives, and I'm not saying which one of them is right, that this could be Elthe with traces of the epsilon remaining, or it could be Elthon, which was an abbreviation and there never was another letter following it. And I'm just reading a smudge on the page as a letter. And it could be either of those. These have been supported by different editors in the past in different publications. And I'm just saying those are both possible, and I don't want to tell you which one I prefer. Okay, so these are things where I can be absolutely explicit about what I'm taking credit for and what I'm giving other people credit for. And so this is what Martina and Osama and I are calling in our paper, making the implicit explicit. So we don't only transcribe, we expand where possible. That is to say, we try not to use abbreviations and jargon. We expand those abbreviations. We explain that jargon, and we attribute ideas to where they've come from, even if we think that other editors in our field would understand this, that it would be obvious. We make it as explicit as possible to everybody. We translate our content, that is both our descriptive content, but also our translations of the text into modern languages. So it has sometimes been the practice of epigraphers to print a Greek or Latin inscription without a translation into a modern language, because after all, anyone who's going to read an epigraphic edition knows Greek and Latin fluently. We want to say for transparency, translate that into a modern language, because that not only makes your text accessible to other scholars, to historians, perhaps to historians of different fields who may not be Greek and Latin experts, to students who may be less comfortable with Greek and Latin than the more advanced scholars, but also because translating is a form of interpretation. It's a form of writing commentary. So by translating it, I'm telling you how I understand that Greek or Latin text. So translating is very important. And I've said potentially modern languages because there's no point me just translating all of my texts into English when we might say English is, in a sense, it's sort of the the lingua franca of Europe now, but that's not true of the whole world. And I'm perfectly happy if anybody objects to the description of English as a lingua franca. I won't argue that case at all. But for the sake of argument, where people say that it is, there are certainly contexts in which it is not. So, for example, I work a lot on the inscriptions of Libya, and I would, I think it would be very silly if the inscriptions that we publish could be read by all sorts of scholars in various parts of the world, but not those who actually live in Libya. And for that matter, non-scholars, people who work there. And English is not, by any sense, a lingua franca in many parts of North Africa. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the final point on here is that illustrate and describe. So you transcribe your text. You also provide a photograph of your text. You describe the object, you say it is a slightly elongated square, it has decoration along the top, and you provide a photograph and maybe a drawing as well, because these will help different audiences. You're being as explicit as possible with what you're doing in there. And so this is just an example of, this is not something that I've been directly involved in, but this is another of the Inscriptions of Libya projects that has a Greek text here in the edition, translated it not only into French, the language of the editor, English, let's call it lingua franca of European scholarship, Italian, the language of the co-editor, but also into Arabic, the language of the country where these inscriptions come from, and where even fewer, let's say, people in Libya would speak English than people in France and Italy. And we by no means want to assume that anybody who might be interested in inscriptions will read English even in those countries. And finally, I think finally, this may be my penultimate slide, but the third part of making the implicit explicit is about recording these references. So what citations are you making, and what are you citing to? Where you can, make those links to those citations, right? So don't just say, APH 1997 602. Say specifically l'année philologique, and also where there is a digital version of it, link to it, or where there isn't, at least link to a library catalog's description of that. So if someone wants to go and check your reference, they know where to go and look that up. Don't assume that every single person who might be interested in checking your reading will know what APH 1997 means and be able to go and find a copy of it, right? So be as explicit as possible about those previous editions, be as explicit as possible about the comparanda to this, to the text that help you with your interpretation, but also be explicit about things that I'm afraid to say it's not always normal for epigraphers and other kinds of archaeologists to be entirely explicit about. So we have the concept of provenance. We'll say where this inscription originally was, where it was found, and maybe where it is now, and some sense of how it got there. But we really want to be as explicit as possible about that entire process, because that process is how this inscription came in front of our eyes, or not, or the eyes of the people who edited it, because we sometimes edit inscriptions that are now lost, so we're basing this only on images, which can include things like purchase history. Was this inscription trafficked? Are we working on things that some of the editors, including ourselves, might have a reason for reading in a particular way? I'm thinking, if you're working on a papyrus and you're saying that a previous editor dated this to a certain year, was that papyrus later stolen and sold to someone who paid more for it because it was considered more valuable because it was dated to that particular year? I'm not naming anybody or naming any papyrus in particular, but some of you, will I think get the sense of the kind of historical events that I'm alluding to. But you don't need that. You don't need quite as explicit in accusing people of dishonesty to see how important it is that all sorts of things in the history of this object and this text and the scholarly relationship, including your own relationship with this text, really is in terms of encoding that. And so these digital methods allow us to be that explicit, but also I would say they at this point they also oblige us to be this explicit. So we can also cite the scholarly sources, not only of previous editions, but of the objects themselves. Where do we get this object from? Is this object in somebody's private collection? And if so, who gave you permission to look at it? Or did you look at it before it got into this person's private collection? And is it now going to be very hard for somebody to come and check your reading because someone else has got it, possibly even an anonymous collector who doesn't want the world to know that they have it? Is this an inscription which you saw in the field, but which another epigrapher claims to have the right to publish? That's often the case. People have quite innocently, any time in the last 60 years, photographed an inscription or found, and this is not a concrete example because I'm not going to say which inscription, but found in photographic archives, very public photographic archives like Flickr or Google Images, a photograph taken by tourists of a piece of stone that happened to be inscribed, that was readable in that photograph because they looked at the text because they might not be able to read it, but they thought it was interesting enough to photograph. And so I or whoever could find that, could transcribe that, could look for it, see, let's see where that inscription is published. It's not published. So make that text available publicly, and then discover that the epigrapher who was given the permissions by the archaeologists to publish that text has been sitting on it since 1949 and has not yet published it. That's information which is important to record, right? Some might say that epigraphy is being unreasonable for keeping it for that long without publishing it. Some might say that the real person behind this story that I'm obscuring here is not me. I should just say, and being unprofessional and uncollegial by publishing this text that's under embargo that someone else should have the permission to publish, even if that permission was given nearly 70 years ago, right? And that they've been sat on ever since. So these sorts of things, it's important to be clear all these various stages in the history of this. And the final point, this is maybe less relevant to Greco-Roman inscriptions, although maybe not relevant at all. I mean, if we think of things like, you know, the Parthenon marbles and similar objects, there are objects from the Greek and Roman worlds that have been trafficked and that people care a lot about the correct ownership of this. But are there people who, other than the country in which the object is held, who have a right to this object and whose sensibilities you ought to take into consideration when you're publishing some aspect of this object? So there's a whole question about that, and all sorts of information around that can also be included now in this sort of digital encoding we're talking about. And the final point, and this slide really ought to say resp equals Martina, because a lot of her ideas are in this one, is the question of what we sometimes call processual metadata. So encoding not only the information about the object itself, but about the scholarly process that you went through in encoding this object, and more importantly, even the editorial conventions that you're using. So if you're encoding this object in EpiDoc, the fact that you're encoding it in EpiDoc is not incidental information, because that steers some of the decisions you make about how you encode it. What are the digital standards you're using? What are the tools and publication standards that you're using for this? So if you've published it using EFES, that will have an impact on the content of the indices. If there's any error in the indices, it's useful to people to know whether that error is your fault for overlooking something or the fault of EFES for having a bug in its code that missed a reference that you had correctly encoded in the EpiDoc. Encoding not only the standard itself, but your local use and customization of that standard and of that set of tools. So nobody publishes using EFES straight out of the box. We all customize it a little bit before we make it public with our data in. What customizations have you made? What local decisions have you made about the way you encode things in EpiDoc? And what this comes down to is partly documentation. So just being absolutely clear about the decisions you've made and the processes you went through in collating your data and so forth, but also in training. I mean, part of the reason that we think EpiDoc training is so important is that the more people understand how EpiDoc works, even if those people aren't all going to publish texts in EpiDoc themselves or create new software to work with EpiDoc themselves, they will become better readers of digital epigraphic projects because they will understand something about the technology that led things to get there. If you see a peculiarity in a digital edition, you say, I bet that was encoded in EpiDoc. And the reason that's there is because you can't do this in EpiDoc, right? Because of that overlapping problem. Things like that that make it very important. So not only documenting what you're doing, but doing everything you can to make sure as large a group of people as possible understand how to use these methods and these technologies. So from that point of view, what I'm doing today is as much part of my digital epigraphic praxis as when I transcribe some text off a stone. It's all part of that same process and documenting that process. Thank you. I'm happy to discuss any aspect of that. Some things I might force Martina to answer if there are questions about her ideas. But
thank you, Gabby, for this thorough exposition of what EpiDoc is and what digital epigraphy is and how it should be done. Maybe now give some floor for comments, questions. Maybe it's a bit for yeah. Janan.
Thank you, Dimitar, for pronouncing my name correctly. Thank you, Gabriel, for the introductory speech. I want to discuss more about this permission issue because it's a huge problem in Turkey, and not the case that the scholars are sitting on material for 70 years, but there is also a lot of excavation material that is actually open to public. You can take photographs as you go visit those ancient cities, but are under excavation. So can you maybe elaborate more on that? Because we are having currently in Turkey that when people see that excavation site is open to tourists, so they think even scholars can come and take photographs and publish them. I mean, not online, but also in journals. Can we maybe discuss it a little bit more?
So one thing I wanted to sort of try and be clear about is that I'm not. I don't think we want to argue either in a general case or in a political case that people either should or shouldn't be able to reserve texts in that way. I think, you know, there's extremes on either end. There's somebody who is in the process of publishing something, a corpus, and, you know, 3 months after they're given permission, someone else publishes all the photographs online and basically says, you know, by you, it's too bad we've got there first. And I think we'd all agree that's really bad practice and uncollegial of them. If I accidentally publish something that someone has been sitting on for 70 years, that's kind of their problem for taking 70 years to publish it. I think we can agree on those two extremes, but there's all sorts of things in the middle, and you know, quite probably there would be 16 different opinions on exactly where that dividing line should be on what's okay and what isn't, just in this call. So the point I wanted to make, and I don't by any means want to shut down on that discussion. I think people might have interesting things to say about that. But the point I wanted to make is that if we're in the habit of being really explicit about where we got this text from, if it's an unpublished text, what the provenance of it is, and who, as far as we're aware, has permissions to do what with the publishing of the text, then a lot of these conflicts of, you know, people being worried that someone else might publish it before them will be mitigated by this transparency. So you know, if I find a text and nowhere is it written who has responsibility for editing that, what's to stop me from doing it? If it's on an archaeological site and I've snuck in as a tourist without telling them that I'm a scholar, and I've taken some photographs and I've gone home and quietly published them without asking who the excavators are, then I kind of know that I'm being sneaky. But the more public this information is, the less danger there is of, you know, my texts being stolen by someone else. I should say my position on who should be allowed to publish texts is probably much more on the liberal end, as in, you know, if I get there first, tough, than most people. But I you know, I do also understand that, you know, some people's careers depend on these sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious about your opinion on it. It's a huge discussion in Turkey, because not only excavation sites but also regions are under survey permission. So on the top of a mountain, you cannot publish anything if you don't have a specific permission for that region. Yeah.
And also, to be clear, although I think ideally if something is in the public, especially if there are photographs of it online, which there quite easily can be, you know, on Flickr or wherever, there shouldn't really be any reason for someone not to publish a transcription.
Yeah. For example, let's think about like inscriptions of Theodosian walls. I mean, do you really need a permission for those inscriptions which have been published many times and many times? Can I just go make my own photos like David does? And yeah. Anyway, yeah, thank you. I think it should be really explicitly given also in the digital.
Someone is going to be given, you know, exclusive permissions to publish something. There should also be a time limit on that. You know, publish them in the next 5 years, otherwise they're open for grabs. You know, or I mean, 5 years is quite long actually for that. But you know, by the same token, I'm you know, if I go to Turkey or Greece on you know, on a tourist visa, well, I don't need a visa to go to Greece, but to you know, somewhere where I do, and then I take photographs and I publish something that I'm not really allowed to do, I could be in trouble for two different reasons, and I'm not going to get myself in trouble and risk not being given a study visa in future, right? So you know, I don't say we should all go out and steal other people's inscriptions. I would say, you know, if I know someone's been sitting on inscriptions for 20 years, I'm going to look at them sternly. You know, that's as far as it's going to go. But I think, sorry, to go back to the question of really the sort of digital explicitness about this. Does anyone, and including Martina or Mitko, have any sense about, you know, how we would go about making these things, developing these standards in such a way that they do discourage people from A, sitting on things for too long, and B, stealing things, or at least so we know what the story is?
Well, I don't know about any way of discouraging somebody from sitting on something on which they have been sitting for. I mean, you cannot force them to possibly publish it, but my 2 cents in the discussion, and I'm kind of anticipating what I'm going to say on Friday when we'll present our new Telemon site, is that, for example, there are some pictures of inscriptions, which in the inscriptions themselves, the monuments themselves have been published, and we have revised them by autopsy. Our epigrapher, Nikolai Sharankov, has revised them by autopsy. And sometimes there are even pictures taken for personal usage. But without the permit of the museum, we cannot publish them, because the monument, as long as it is in some sort of inventory, it is part of a museum collection, and they own the rights to at least the publication of the images of the physical body of the monument, if not of its content or metadata or whereabouts. But what we're trying to do now is to negotiate our way into some sort of a collaboration with the museums, because most of the museums are small regional museums in places which the general public or the specialized public who does epigraphy or ancient history or sigillography or whatnot would generally not go to specifically visit. But if we deal with them some sort of exposure through our collection to the site of the museum, to like giving credits to the museum and to the people who work in the museum, in exchange of their allowance to use their pictures, there might be some common ground for some reasonable extent of collaboration. Maybe they will not give us like 100 images to publish, but at least 1 or 2 up-to-date images in exchange of some images from 60 years ago scanned from a paper corpus. This is quite something. And then a link to the museum collection. and if it's online, all the better. Some description of the monument itself, and this is what we're currently trying to do, and I think this is one of the ways to do it. We will see if this is successful. Probably depends a lot on the particular persons involved or the monuments involved, things like that.
But if I may add something on this point, I think that the question of exposure is hugely important, because we will introduce ourselves later, but I work with Byzantine lead seals, which are a very small, very overlooked piece of evidence, and they're not like huge inscriptions, in the middle of a field in Turkey. So it's a very small thing that very often museums, also big museums and big archives, don't even know that they have. And I'm thinking about a very specific example. So it would be, speaking of exposure, also to discourage people who have been sitting on materials for decades now. This thing of negotiating a deal, like, okay, we are giving to a very interested public, your collection or a piece of your collection, which we will scholarly publish and evaluate and all sorts of things in exchange for images. So and this is, I think, as explicit and as transparent as it gets, as far as a museum or a big public collection is concerned, because you have also a written deal, I would say, on both parts that kind of proves that they have given you the permission to do so, and we will do so in a time frame of, I don't know, 24 months. But that's for newly closed deals. But I think that all of us can come up with examples of things which it should have been published for 40 years, and what to do with that. But on the topic of forcing, very taking it with a grain of salt, forcing people to publish using a digital standard, I am still sitting on this topic and thinking of that. But I think that coming back to our paper just for a sec, I think that's a topic that should be addressed is really the one of exposure and of giving an underlooked piece of history its place, because it's not that I'm always thinking about Byzantine seals. So it's very difficult to read, it's very cryptic and so on and so forth, but this is our job. We have to open pieces of evidence to the world so that historians can rely on our experience and our openness and transparency in dealing with the material. So that's my 2 cents on the history.
We could probably carry on talking about this forever, and I sort of want to follow up on that a little bit, but I also I'm willing to be shut up if people have any other questions. So maybe we should pause for a moment.
If there are any other questions, Gav, you're more than welcome to follow up on that.
Well, I only wanted to sort of say that while I wanted to be very clear that nothing we say today or at any other point in this workshop or in any paper we might write should ever be construed as legal advice, because it is not. We do have to distinguish between what we're legally allowed to do, both under national laws and under copyright, and because copyright can't stop us except in very limited circumstances. I believe in Egypt, for example, the government claims copyright on all their ancient heritage, but usually copyright has no way of stopping us from publishing a text that was written more than 90 years after the death of the author, right? To use the most restrictive rule in the world. And so any ancient text, the author's been dead for all that time, you know, there's nothing to stop us from republishing that text under copyright law. What we're talking about is academic expectation. No one could sue me for publishing an inscription that I found that someone else has permission to write, but what they could do is criticize me publicly and potentially damage my career and so forth. So there's reasons for wanting to be careful about this. But so what needs to change? I don't think any laws need to change. I mean, some silly laws do, but that's not what's the issue here. It's that academic expectations need to be, and what that's about is the rather hopeless dream of shattering the hierarchy a little bit, of saying, you know, that you know, the 9 most senior epigraphers in the world should no longer control the discipline, and that's that well, we can dream, but that I think is what this comes down to. It's you know, the people whose interest is in keeping this status quo are the people who can damage the career of people like us. You know, we don't well, they can't do much to my career because I'm not in epigraphy, I'm in digital humanities, so you know, I can be a scapegoat in this if you like, but you know what I mean. It's the power hierarchies that make this difficult to resolve. It's a sort of Gordian knot in a sense, where I'm not sure what cutting it would look like.
I totally agree with what you just said, and I think that another thing that needs to change and should change in this respect is also the value of the publications. Because, I mean, what I mean is that a seal or an inscription or whatever is valuable, has its value, as long as it's unpublished. And I mean, you have to like have your hands everywhere in order to have as many unpublished material as possible, so that you can publish as much as possible, so that all this publish or perish you know, sick academia, you know, mechanism can go on and on. So that's also the thing that people say, okay, I'll publish it. And of course, people whose career is at the very beginning need to publish more in this kind of scenario than 90 years old emeriti, of course. But yes, I mean, I don't know what to add to what I just said, but I think that this is also an issue in all of this thing, also because on the other hand, also the perception of the digital publication as something less valuable than a paper publication, which in this circle of, I mean, it's not the case, of course, and it is not the case because it's not the case. But yes, I'm still waiting. I mean, I don't know if a corpus of Byzantine lead seals published online should count as habilitation in a German university. So let's just put it that way. Yes, so this is also an issue that hinders kind of the openness of everything. And I mean, it's counterintuitive if you want, because I mean, we are scholars and researchers before people who publish things. So we should want, like, I mean, science to be open and everything to be accessible, and students and everyone to have access to as much information as possible. So I think that's also like another piece of the mosaic, which is sorely lacking as for now.
But I think the question of being explicit and being and the kinds of explicitness that the digital publication allow us, because in print it would look silly if for each and every one of your 60 seals that you're publishing in this one article, you also have 3 paragraphs about where you found it, right? I mean that just doesn't fit. But the ways you can embed this information in various ways in digital publications and make it both extremely explicit and easier to navigate. There are other benefits to that, as well as other aspects of access to these inscriptions and permissions and ethical rights to publish, because we've already distinguished between legal and academic expectations, but there are also other ethical issues that come into this. And so one aspect of this that is quite often discussed even in epigraphy, especially with portable objects, is should we refuse to publish trafficked objects where we don't know their original provenance? And there are some disciplines where this is absolutely understood. You do not publish trafficked objects. If an object is unprovenanced and was probably pillaged from an ancient site in the last couple of decades and made its way onto the antiquities market, you do not encourage that market by publishing it, however you acquired it. And other people will say, but we're losing information about the ancient world, which we can't afford to lose, and so forth. So have an embargo period of 20 years, because in 20 years' time, we'll still be as keen for that information as we are now, or whatever. But there's so questions about the provenance and the ethics, publishing information, and as I said, this doesn't really happen with Greek and Roman inscriptions. But we can't talk in complete isolation. But if what you're looking at is a 19th century Aboriginal Australian text that you're transcribing from somewhere, who wrote the text? Is what do they think? What does their community, their culture think about that text? It could be a sacred text which was never meant to be made public, and by publishing it, you're broaching sacred taboos. Which some people would say, well, I don't really care, I only care about knowledge. And it's like, well, can I go and pillage your grandmother's tomb in that case then? Because it's not, we have taboos as well. So these sorts of ethics and these sorts of questions, again, being explicit about where we got this text from. I'm not sure whether I have permission to publish this or not, but here is everything I do know about the provenance and the responsibilities around this text. These are all the people I know who've seen it. This is the museum that holds it. This is where the museum claimed to have got it from. There's the famously pillaged Easter Island statue in the British Museum. That the label for the statue in the museum doesn't say this was pillaged from Easter Island. It says this was a gift from Queen Victoria. And it stops there. It doesn't say where she got it from, who gifted it to her, and where they pillaged it from, or whatever. Yeah, it's really this. It's about being more explicit, and not only are we enabled to be more explicit, but we really are obliged to be more explicit for all of those reasons. And that again, that helps to prevent these sorts of accusations that well, you knew that I had permissions to publish that. And so you shouldn't have done it, because everything that I knew about what I was and wasn't supposed to do, I said in my digital text. So it sort of much helps us to be, it keeps us honest, if you like. I mean, just as my apparatus criticus saying I came up with this reading was from a previous scholar. That's just being honest about where my text is coming from. I think that has to go several layers deeper than that.
Definitely.
Okay.
It will be a very long paper.
Well, I was going to say, I know you agree with me. I don't know about everyone else in this.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else? I guess it's maybe for many of the participants, maybe it's too early to. We're just now getting started, but still, if you wish. If not,
I kind of, sorry, was someone speaking?
No.
no.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of wish I had a sock puppet now, because there's sort of a question I want to raise, not to ask myself, but to sort of bring back up, which is the question of translation. We talked about translating into multiple languages and things like that. I don't know if people have any thoughts about that, if an epigraphic edition or sigillographic edition of apological edition is translated only into English, is that okay?
Please, Cornelia wants to say something.
By the way, you can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can raise your hands with the reactions button.
Okay, yeah, I've been wondering about the question of the translation. Is it the epigrapher who is making the choice of the range of languages into which it gets translated? I mean, you had Arabic, you had a couple of modern Western European languages there. Could have added Chinese if you want to really reach a huge global audience. Can you do all of that yourself? Are you employing a translator? Who's verifying if you go really broad? In the selection of languages you choose, whether it's still accurate. I mean, if it's a couple of words, it's a short inscription, that's not so much of a deal, but there could be longer texts. And in principle, I am 100,000% for translating the material, no matter what the customs have been in the past. It's necessary to definitely translate it into something, one or two or three more widely accessible modern day languages. So that would be my feeling about that. So I would certainly say yes, but how exactly do you go about, and is there a team of people who are looking? I mean, you said the EpiDoc, or it was said early on in the session a little bit that you are a network of people or a group of people collaborating. I could see that out of that, there is enough expertise to say, okay, we can resource English, French, Arabic, obviously also, and maybe a few others. Then you'd have a team of translators on hand to do this.
I think, yeah, to throw into that, two things. One, we said, or I said, and I would stand by it, that translating is an act of interpretation. Right? I think that's uncontroversial. So if I'm translating the Greek text into English and French that I can translate into comfortably, and someone translates it into German and Italian, and I can read those, even though I wouldn't be comfortable putting them into those translations, that's fine. I then get someone else to translate it into Arabic and someone else to translate it into Chinese. Whose act of interpretation is that now? It's partly mine, because they're presumably translating from my English or one of the other languages, but it's also partly the translator, because they're the ones translating. And if I can't check that, so who gets an authorial credit on that? I mean, it's part of that. Who gets a RESP statement with their name in it, right? That it's not just me anymore. There's other names in there. The example I showed you there, which was from the inscriptions of Greek Cyrenaica, the Arabic translation was made by someone who has knowledge of a Greek epigraphy. So they base their translation on the English or the French, I don't know which, but they could also check against the Greek and Latin, just to be to be sure of that. So it was reasonable. But are you asking people to translate who can read the original languages? Are you asking people to translate from a third language? That's not uncommon in translation of literature, by the way, that people will translate. A Spanish novel will be translated into Latvian by a Latvian translator who doesn't know any Spanish. They're translating the English. That sort of thing happens. So do both translators get a credit at that point? And the other question is, beyond a certain level of the core team who are working on these texts and the languages they have between them, What are you asking other translators to do that you couldn't do with Google Translate, or with, let's say, maybe a slightly more sophisticated translation algorithm, because Google Translate can be idiosyncratic? Do I really need to translate my corpus into Chinese when, if someone really wants to read my English and can't, they have Google Translate?
Yeah, but then you could take it a step back and say, okay, translate everything into English, and the rest of the world can handle it from there with these tools for the needs that they have.
Yeah,
that'd be one aspect.
But
I think the other questions you asked, you raised or asked, you made a big point about being very explicit about everything that's implicit. You could easily add a footnote or the equivalent in a markup tag or so and say, okay, translation from into handled by this person, and that's just a couple of characters to write. So
True.
Yes, definitely. I think that it's also, I mean, in the sense of transparency, very important to say, as you, Cornelia said, from which language into which language it has been translated, because it is one thing if one is able to read the Greek, the German, the Old Church Slavonic, and translate it into Italian or German, or if I have to go through English, which is, as we all know, another type of exercise. And yes, but yeah, I mean, I was not asked about my my views on translation, but I completely agree with Cornelius, and yes, and as far as it's very interesting that you raised the point, about the range and the span of translations. I mean, how many does it make sense to have, which is the expected audience also, which is, I mean, it's a question that I raised, that I ask only for the sake of the argument, because we don't want like to make our audience too small, because of course it's like a circle. If we do not open some kinds of material to Chinese audience, just because we already mentioned this language, they won't read it, and of course there won't be a demand for this kind of materials. That's what I wanted to say. So yes, I mean, our corpus of Byzantine-led seals that also, as Mitko said, we're going to talk about on Friday. We have we are a team of Italian people working in Germany, France, and having somewhat a grasp of English. So it will be in English, in German, and in French, because we did not have the time yet to do it in Italian, which is somehow an interesting point. But yes, of course, when the time comes, we also have people ready to help us with Greek, because Greek is also a very big issue. Of course, because it's not that all Greek people or Greek-speaking people understand ancient Greek, just like not only Italian and French people understand Latin. So it's not. It's not immediate. There's also a need for modern Greek translations of ancient Greek sources, which is an interesting point, I would say.
Yeah. And to go back to the example Cornelia gave, which I think wasn't the argument she was making. It was more of a straw person argument, that you could then in that case just say, I'll just translate everything into English and let Google Translate do the rest. Let everyone else in the world deal with reading from the English. If you're once you've taken that position, then there's absolutely zero argument to say that has to be English. Let's say translate into whatever language you want: English, German, French, Italian, modern Greek, Turkish, whatever language you want, Bulgarian, and let everyone else deal with that using Google Translate. And that, I think, a lot of people would probably be slightly less comfortable with, especially, I guess, Anglophone people. But you know, at that point, if we're allowing machine translation, we know that, you know, trying to read a Google Translate's rendering of a Bulgarian translation of a Greek inscription is going to be a mess. Why you know, why don't we expect every other possible permutation of languages to be a mess as well?
I might consider going in the direction saying that the epigrapher has to translate into her or his own native language. So I don't like the idea that you have a group of Italians work in these different places and then they don't produce, first of all, an Italian translation. I think that's the first must, and then the others can follow.
I would say that it all depends on what people are initially involved in the project. As Martina said, the joint academic German-French initiative of people who also happen to be Italian native speakers. It makes sense that at least these languages should be present without too much effort. Whereas if you have only, say, speaker of one among these languages, I mean, it's more reasonable to start smaller and then expand with some people who could read the material in the original language and then translate it in their own. I think the same holds true, for example, for the example that Gabi showed with the inscriptions from Libya. I guess that, of course, there were people from British Academy involved, so one of the languages is English. I guess there were some scholars of Arabic origin, which that's why they could read the original text and translate it into Arabic. Scholarly literature, which was in French, because French was the lingua franca of the North Africa for long decades, including in the edition of inscriptions. So it makes sense that there's English, and this is a matter of effort versus result ratio at first, probably.
Yeah, I think we are coming back to that example as being quite a good guideline of the way to do it, and I think they'd be quite pleased to hear that. But yes, the scholars who were involved in producing that edition were French and Italian, so those languages are in there by default. It was in English partly because we collaborated with them from the UK, but also partly I think they probably would have put it in English as well anyway, because, you know, it is, like it or not, it is sort of a lingua franca of scholarship at the moment. And Arabic, I don't remember whether the person who translated into Arabic was a core member of the team or whether they were brought in specifically for the Arabic translation. But it was very much, you know, these are Libyan inscriptions, we have to put it into Arabic as well. The vast majority of people in Libya won't be able to read English. So that's absolutely essential. So I think they've covered all the bases there. There's all sorts of other languages that we could translate it into, but they were the ones, you know, the essential ones and the ones that they could do themselves easily. And they covered all those bases. So I think in terms of the decisions we make, we would probably say that was the right sort of balance. And putting it into all these other modern languages, likewise, the inscriptions of Aphrodisias should have been translated, also into Turkish. On the London publication of that, online publication of that, they haven't been, but they should be. And if we decide to do a second edition someday, which we might, it would be kind of rude of us not to, having now I've said that out loud.
Yes, and also
of the Northern Black Sea are published in Russian as well as in
yes. Yes.
Not Ukrainian, maybe controversially, but
yes, and also the matter of translation is also tied to the, let's say, repatriation or virtual repatriation of some of the artifacts that we're dealing with. For example, again, the example of Byzantine seals should be like by default translated into modern Greek and Turkish, to say the least. Because then we cannot also take into account all the expansions and shrinking of the Byzantine empires throughout the centuries. So that would be too much. But
Yeah.
still, I mean, yes, and if we know that they were like acquired and they were found or excavated in Turkey, then we should also translate our corpus into Turkish as perhaps a second step, since we don't have any colleagues in this moment working on the team, but still. Oh, that's great. So, are there any question, remarks? Just say it out loud or raise your hand. Otherwise, we can migrate into the Wonder Me room set so that we get to know each other in a less, formal setting.
Before not being recorded.
No, you're super invited. We don't have drinks because it's too early, but still.
No. I was saying where, I'm just reminding myself that we are still being broadcast here, and so.
Yes.
We won't be in Wonder Me.
No, we won't be anymore broadcasted. Yeah. So if there are no many questions which you want to ask on air, I will just end the streaming, provided I know how to do that.